Daniel Kahneman once said that people do not base their beliefs on reasons, and the power of reason was actually an illusion, because the beliefs do not change when the reasons were refuted. He says the causality is reversed, that people believe the reasons because they believe the conclusions to which those reasons lead. Beliefs are derived from narratives, and narratives are fundamental to the environment in which all economic activity takes place and in which institutions evolve. Narratives are also socially determined, and the more widely accepted the narrative, the more powerful it is. Narratives also influence individual and collective decision-making. This schematic shows how individual traits such as intelligence, experience, and openness pass through cultural narratives on the way toward making decisions which will impact the environment. But the same schematic applies to the acceptance and interpretation of environmental information flowing the other way. Individuals could subscribe to multiple narratives, and when narratives conflict, an opportunity is presented for evolution and development. Brad DeLong, in Slouching Toward Utopia, frames the entire 20th century as the playing of tensions between two opposing economic narratives, epitomized by the works of Friedrich Hayek and Karl Polanyi. For Hayek, the bottom-up spontaneous order of laissez-faire economics was the only route to economic prosperity. Economic centralization would always lead to bad decisions due to bad information, because the relevant information was always at the individual or local level. Markets were a wondrous mechanism for sorting and acting on that information, and governments' attempts to manage this information processing task would result in loss of liberty and serfdom. Social justice for Hayek was a fantasy, since justice or fairness meant you receive what you deserve, but since markets didn't deliver desserts, and trying to force them to do so would only mar the pristine market workings that delivered prosperity. In fact, too much democracy would lead people to claim a share of the wealth that wasn't rightly theirs, because they hadn't submitted to the discipline required to produce it, and their claims would need to be suppressed through a strong central authority. The role of the government should be minimal, just enough to maintain order and to enforce property rights. Prosperity naturally results in inequality because people are inherently unequal. Polanyi, on the other hand, saw the markets as tools for human well-being, and describing land, labor, and finance as commodities was nonsensical, as they were socially embedded and not subject to the logic of profit. People have rights to both a stable community through land and a right to suitable target income through labor. Finance was the flow of purchasing power in communities, and as such was to be locally and socially administered. Polanyi said a pure market economy does not respect these rights, and markets try to inappropriately commodify elements of social life, and that there will be a backlash as communities attempt to regain control and perhaps even revolutions. Thus, we have two relatively distinct narratives about the purpose and goals of an economy, and how best to support it and how to measure its effectiveness. Both Hayek and Polanyi were intending to promote human fulfillment and well-being. Both had very different takes on the relationship between institutional economic structures and the society that creates them. One could perhaps be described as more socially oriented, one more individualistic. Each predicts negative social consequences from unfettered workings of markets, and we also see elements of subsidiarity in both. The Wall Street Journal article, "Is reclining your airplane seat upright behavior or downright rude?" is, as expected from the title, about airline seat reclining norms. But even this trite and tired debate contains echoes of these two narratives. If the airline seats came with a reclining option that was in the bundle of rights you purchased with your ticket, then of course you should use it if you want. You earned it with your purchase. But reclining seats in the current squishy environment causes discomfort to the passenger behind you, and we're all in this mess together. Note that the article doesn't make room for telling airlines to maintain a psychologically respectful seating arrangement, though in 2018 Congress mandated that the FAA set a minimum size, but only in the context of cabin evacuations, but it hasn't done so yet. According to Robert Shiller, economic narratives have a moral valence. They are stories with a packaged set of values and corresponding implications for actions in various situations. These narratives become scripts, heuristics that lead to common behaviors and attitudes. Some narratives resonate better than others, and some narratives come to dominate discourse. Narratives, like other institutions, evolves. So while narratives can affect economic outcomes, those economic outcomes should in turn modify the narratives. Capitalism was understood by the classicists to be an evolution of mercantilism. For-profit trade left merchants with excess purchasing power. Thus, they had the means to participate in the mechanizing end of the Industrial Revolution. Merchant wealth became capital once they had industrialism to which they could apply that wealth. This transition was thus historically contingent, and the logic of mercantilist compensation for the risks involved in the sourcing and transport of foreign goods was transferred to employing capital toward industrial production. Thus, the economic system, historical events, and the narrative evolve together. But if such narrative systems evolve, what is it that leads sociologists like Mark Fisher to claim it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism? There are many flavors of capitalism, such as oligarchic, corporate, and welfare state, but I believe the conventional usage, and the capitalism Fisher laments, is currently known as market fundamentalism, that began in the U.S. and has been exported worldwide. One possible reason for the hegemony of market fundamentalism is that while narratives naturally evolve based on events and experiences, they can also be intentionally promoted. Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway describe in The Big Myth how U.S. actors took specific steps starting in the late 1900s to inculcate market fundamentalism as the predominant narrative. The story begins when private electricity providers were not willing to electrify rural communities because the market wasn't large enough to warrant the costs. As a result, there was a call for establishing public utilities. In 1885, the National Electric Light Association, NELA, was founded to address this perceived problem. NELA's narrative was that government involvement in the marketplace was a departure from U.S. history, and as such was un-American. Furthermore, free market capitalism was the embodiment of freedom itself, and government involvement in any activity that should be properly the domain of free enterprise was socialistic and tyrannical. Such involvement would undermine individual initiative and ultimately destroy American prosperity. NELA initiated a concerted education campaign to promote this laissez-faire programming consisting of 3 types of activities. First, they paid academics to write papers supporting the desired outcomes. In this case, that privately provided electricity was demonstrably cheaper than publicly provided electricity, which got extended to private provision is cheaper than public provision in general. Second, textbooks were rewritten to remove any reference to the benefits of public works and espousing market fundamentalism's new ideology. And third, university research programs were funded to promote market fundamentalism. Congress and the FTC eventually cottoned on to what NELA was up to, and they passed the Public Utility Holding Company Act of 1935, restricting the reach of any given company. NELA disbanded in 1933 and reformed as the Edison Electric Institute. NELA passed the baton to the National Association of Manufacturers, NAM, who worked ardently to promote what became known as the indivisibility principle, which in its words was, "Free enterprise is as much an indivisible part of democracy and the source of as many blessings and benefits as are our other freedoms of speech, press, and religion." This principle was advertised through billboards, newspaper articles, magazine advertisements, comic series, the American Family Robinson radio show, and films such as Your Town, A Story of America, and in a series of scholastic newsreels. In 1935, NAM appointed John Fifield to found a religious political organization called Spiritual Mobilization, which produced sermon writing campaigns and conferences for pastors nationwide. NAM's religious political activities led to publications still in print today, such as Norman Peale's The Power of Positive Thinking and the newsletters Faith and Freedom and Guideposts. NAM also moved Frederick Hayek to the United States and ensconced him at the bastion of free market ideology that was the University of Chicago. NAM promoted Hayek's The Road to Serfdom and paid for a Reader's Digest version emphasizing the book's most libertarian elements. NAM also funded Hayek's Mont Pelerin Society, an international organization of economists, historians, philosophers, and business leaders advocating not only free markets but increasing the privatization of public functions. Thus, we see that narratives can be socially engineered to great effect with enough will and resources. Where might this all lead? Jack Goldstone and Peter Turchin predict that we are entering the turbulent 20s with increasing social unrest and political instability. Their model suggests that throughout history the following pattern repeats. First, faced with dampening of growth and productivity, elites seek to take a larger portion of economic gains for themselves, which increases inequality. Then, faced with greater competition for wealth and status, they tighten up the path to mobility to favor themselves and their children. Finally, in an effort to hold on to their rising fortunes, they do all they can to resist taxation of their wealth and profits, even if it means gutting social programs, infrastructure, and education. This selfish behavior, in the context of simmering conditions of inequality, unfairness, and a declining effectiveness and respect for government, leads to revolutions. Turchin's models demonstrate that this cycle has occurred numerous times in history. We also hear echoes here of Hayek and Polanyi in their recognition that social unrest will arise from inequality. We hear Markowitz in the narrowing of the pathways to economic success in a meritocracy, and Piketty in the inevitability of inequality when R is allowed to run greater than G. And we can even hear echoes all the way back to Ibn Khaldun with the broad cycles of the growth and collapse of urban systems. Michael Jacobs writes about the history of economic paradigm shifts. An economic paradigm has several components described as 1. A set of economic goals which are regarded as most important. 2. A general analytical framework for understanding the way economies and societies work. And 3. A public narrative and language which simply describes and justifies the goals and the analytical framework. And 4. A set of principal economic and social policies which will achieve the goals based on the analytical framework. Economic paradigm shifts occur when the prevailing orthodoxy dominates economic debate and policy, economic shocks and crises occur, yet policy prescriptions fail. The orthodox economic theory and discourse are increasingly questioned. An alternative theoretical and policy approach has been developed in the meantime. And 6, as breakdown occurs, people reach for the new approach, which becomes the dominant paradigm. I'm going to conclude with a comment about number 5. The alternative theoretical approach has not yet been developed, and its lack prevented the 2008 global financial crisis from manifesting change, and it is still lacking. According to the Oreskes story, the narrative seeds planted in the 1930s didn't reach fruition until the 1970s, so we'd better get started, and I believe complexity science will serve as the foundation for this future economic paradigm.